man becomes Christ, becomes God's own human nature. If one thinks of Jesus as Almighty God, then of course there is no human model or spiritual life to recapitulate. To be transformed into Christ does not mean transformation into God or transformed into the man Jesus. Transformation into the man Jesus. Rather, transformation is man's earthly human nature becoming God's one and only eternal, universal human nature. Christ, that is. And here's a marginalia. Is the Logos recapitulating creation every time it recapitulates Jesus' interior life in the soul? Back to the text. It is one thing to relate one's life with God to Jesus' historical life with God, yet it is quite another to know his human experiences by way of one's own. While we cannot verify Jesus' experience or particular states prior to encountering them ourselves, yet when and if we do, then there is a marvelous recognition of the truth of Christ. And we begin to understand how it went for the earthly incarnate Christ is exactly how it goes for every human being. Thus, we literally recapitulate Christ's human, earthly, spiritual journey and ultimate transformation. In this way, our experiences not only verify Christ's human experience, but at the same time, Christ verifies our own. Mere belief cannot verify the truth of Christ. It is only in our own life with God that the truth of Christ can be verified, known, and lived. We are not transformed into some other human being, nor transformed into God, but transformed into Christ, God's own human nature, eternally one with its divine nature. Although some people think this process of incarnation started at the moment of creation and not at the historical time of the man Jesus, yet imposing time on God's doings is always a fruitless speculation. What God can do in a second can seem like thousands of years to man. All we know is that Christ was only revealed at a particular time in history, not before and not after. As to how long it took God to create and unite man eternally to itself, what could be a more inane question? All we know is that at some point God ordained man's ultimate destiny, and at some point revealed this to all mankind. This knowledge was the major purpose of the revelation called the Incarnation, the revelation of God's plan for man, revelation of the way it goes for all men, the end being Christ, the eternal oneness of God and man. This is the meaning of Christ as the Alpha and Omega of man and all creation. It seemed to be Paul's view that when God initially created mankind, Adam in Hebrew, the Logos was, from the beginning, incarnate in man, or one with man. This is what was meant by man being created in the, quote, image of God, which image was the incarnate Logos, the same image that, for Paul, was, quote, the Spirit made visible, end quote. That mankind, Adam, was created without sin, Paul likens to Jesus, who, because he had no human father, was born without sin, like us in all ways but sin, end quote. The basis of this understanding, however, was the widely held belief that there existed only one original soul handed down via the male seed, generation after generation. Thus, the Judaic belief was that man's, Adam's, one original soul was handed down one generation after another, a soul, however, tainted by Adam's fall, his sin. So given Paul's Judaic belief that the male seed generates the soul of the offspring explains why he and others believed, because God created the soul or life of Jesus, one not handed down from a human father, this made Jesus the only sinless man, apart from Adam, God ever created. No question. One of the most overlooked revelations of the Incarnation is that God alone creates each soul, a soul just as sinless as the first human being ever created. God, after all, cannot create sin or a sinful soul. So the fact that God creates every individual soul as innocent and sinless as Adam negates Paul's view that only Jesus was born sinless. Since the world at large had this same view, fathers handing down their soul or life to their offspring, this was man's long-held world belief, Jew and Gentile alike. But what if Paul had understood that God alone creates every individual soul, a soul no different than the innocent, sinless soul of Adam? What then would have been Paul's understanding of Jesus' messianic mission? In the light of this truth, what becomes of the Christian paradigm based on Jesus' mission to redeem, restore, atone, all this Christian sin business? Absolutely, it would make one look further to understand the revelation of the Incarnation and Christ. In truth, the Incarnation had not a single thing to do with sin. Footnote 2, page 316. Judaism never regarded its Messiah as a man sent to redeem man from sin or die to atone for them. But if Judaism believed God forgave sins, there was still the problem of atonement, i.e., making good one's injuries to his fellow man, requiring some form of restoration, redemption. Undoing a wrong against one's fellow man, however, is rarely possible, even if one regrets his actions. Since an exact repayment is rarely possible, for Paul at least, Jesus' death was this exact repayment on behalf of all offenders. So for Paul, the solution of restoration was God sending his Son to, quote, pay the price, end quote, atone for all men. While this vicarious atonement cannot do one's neighbor any good, it may, however, relieve the perpetrator of his guilt. All we can say is that Paul's notion of Christ as man's, quote, atoner has never sunk in. Payback is the cause of all wars. So one end of the footnote. So one totally overlooked revelation of the Incarnation is that God alone creates each human soul, and that no soul is a hand-me-down from any natural father. Furthermore, to create the body of a human being, the mother's genes and chromosomes are equally as necessary as the father's. Thus, it was not just Mary that supplied the flesh of Jesus, but God as well. So the notion that Jesus' human nature only came from Mary, and that his divine nature or soul came from God, is a Platonic notion that can be dismissed out of hand. Although the fathers consistently say Jesus got his human nature from Mary, obviously this view is not true. Human nature is more than a body. God alone created the individual soul of Jesus' human nature, not Mary. Also, had God not supplied the male counterpart to her ovum, Jesus would never have been conceived. Had Mary not been needed, then Jesus could just have, well, appeared out of thin air. It was by having no natural father, Jesus would know he came from God, was one with God, and without God could not have existed. So Jesus' human soul came right from the hand of God, as does every soul. It was Paul's belief, because Adam did not live up to the, quote, image of God, end quote, he lost this image, fell. And since his fallen soul was passed on to his offspring, the purpose of Christ's coming was to restore man to his original sinless nature, restore the image of God in which he was created. This was not just Paul's view of sinful or tainted souls. It seems like this was Jesus's same Judaic belief. Thus, since his soul, like Adam, was created by God and not some hand-me-down, he could align his messianic mission to restoring man to his original nature, the image of God, that is. Where Adam's fall had closed the gates of heaven, Christ came to open the gates for everyone. For Paul, then, redemption meant the restoration of man to his original sinless nature, which original image is Christ. Thus, Jesus, as a second Adam, mankind in Hebrew, was a reproduction or restoration of the first Adam,